Australia takes pride in its clean, green food. We hear the terms Australian beef, the greatest, true Aussie beef, and carbon neutral beef. We also hear that beef production has the greatest environmental cost of any industry, and that US beef and dairy industries will be bankrupt within a decade due to their environmental cost and new technology. Who are we to believe? In 2013, the UN-backed group The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or TEEB, reported on the environmental cost of industries globally. TEEB puts a dollar value on the environment. It turns out that the environmental damage done by the beef industry in Australia is 5 times greater than the industry's income. In 2013 figures, the beef industry was costing the Australian environment $14 billion US per year. So what are these environmental costs? Let's look at ecosystems. Earlier this year, we learned that 19 of 20 Australian ecosystems will collapse if we don't take urgent action. More than 80% of native vegetation has been cleared on brigalow and mallee forests, 70% of open mallee woodlands are gone, and half the eucalypt woodlands have been cleared. And what is by far the greatest land use in most of these ecosystems? Grazing. Then there's forests. Australia is now ranked as a global deforestation front by WWF. Ours is the only developed nation on that list. They note that the most significant driver by far is beef production. In Queensland alone, 10 square kilometres of bushland is cleared every day, the equivalent of clearing bushland for a new suburb every day. That's nearly 2 acres of bushland cleared every minute for beef and sheep. If we overlay Australian land use with original vegetation remaining, we can identify grazing to be responsible for about 90% of Australian deforestation since colonisation. What about wildlife? Over 44 million native animals were killed due to deforestation in Queensland alone, according to WWF. 3/4 of our plants and animals are now listed as threatened, from habitat destruction and invasive species that come with that, and they consider cattle as an invasive species. Grazing is the main driver of habitat destruction. Each year, we deliberately burn the woodlands and savannas of northern Australia for pasture maintenance. And with introduced grasses like gamba grass, fires are many times hotter, changing ecosystems, killing animals, particularly birds. Feral cats have been identified as a major threat to wildlife in Australia, implicated in mammal extinctions. The apex predator that would keep feral cats under control, dingoes, are killed as wild dogs. This baiting is done to protect grazed animals. Then there's the Great Barrier Reef. One of the main killers of the Great Barrier Reef is sediment. In 2016, the Queensland Government spent $7 million purchasing a cattle station in the far north to stem the source of 40% of Normanby River sediment, emptying out onto the then pristine far north reefs. Deforestation and overgrazing in the Fitzroy, Burdekin and other reef catchments is a major reef killer. Only a few graziers take any notice of the voluntary code to fence off and not clear trees near watercourses. Sadly, now that another drought has ended, short-sighted graziers are stocking up, driving cattle prices to all-time highs. The problem is that this hydro-illogical cycle will end in tears again. When the next drought hits, beef prices will bottom out and the land is left bare, overgrazed, flogged again. Then the rain comes and the Great Barrier Reef suffers again. Most of the reef-killing sediment comes from grazing lands. Government stands aside as this vicious cycle continues. Then we come to climate. Meat and Livestock Australia have announced a plan for carbon neutral beef by 2030. But reading the fine print, their task is to offset emissions relative to a 2005 baseline. reduce emissions back to that 2005 deforestation baseline, and we call that carbon neutral. So it's not carbon neutral at all. This is the same dodgy accounting the federal government is using now to weasel out of any real climate action. Australia copped criticism for adopting a deforestation baseline in the original Kyoto Agreement, nicknamed the Australia Clause, and we're doing it again. So MLA are using the same trickery. Most people would call that marketing spin. It's not carbon neutral at all, not even close. Seaweed feed supplements are touted as a breakthrough tech solution to methane. But the seaweed's unpalatable, so can only be fed in feedlots. Even if seaweed does reduce methane by 80% in feedlot cattle, most methane comes from grazed cattle, and feedlots produce only a few percent of the methane. So at best, seaweed supplements will only reduce overall methane by a few percent. Hardly breakthrough. Regenerative grazing is touted to be a game changer, but this can only offset a small fraction of ruminant emissions. Oh, and by the way, it's not profitable, so only the enthusiasts will make an effort. But by far the biggest climate cost of beef is the potential of grazing land for sequestration. Rewilding, reforesting grazing land globally would draw down decades of emissions. And by the way, this is the cheapest climate fix by a long shot. A few years back, drought scenes were common and sympathy for farmers was high. As seasons changed and more extreme weather beset the nation, these images turned to fire-ravaged animals, then news of thousands of animals dying in floodwaters. Still, convoys of hay were being sent to the people on the land, and millions of taxpayer dollars were funneled to farmers. But we now know that these lamentable events are inevitable, that every picture of a starving animal is an indictment on farmers. Every convoy of hay is rewarding poor management. We know that in our changing climate, droughts in Australia are more frequent, more severe, and more prolonged. Must we see more dying animals, more dead fish, more emergency flood relief to make us understand that this is the new normal, no longer the exception? Do we accept that graziers have the right to profit from the good years and be propped up by taxpayers in the drought years, at the expense of degrading the land? Some scientists say no. They believe we should accept the new climate normal in Australia, and we should be making a planned retreat from country that is no longer dependable. Last year, a huge property in New South Wales Channel Country was sold to state government as a nature reserve. Narriara Station had been producing sheep and beef for 150 years, but the new climate makes it productive for only 2 years out of every 10. In reality, the Australian beef industry is a massive environmental Ponzi scheme. The ecological and environmental cost has been hundreds of billions of dollars over the years, and now these costs are demanding payment in degraded land, ecosystem collapse, endangered and extinct species, Great Barrier Reef die-off, and a hostile climate. And who has benefited from this scheme? Most beef producers don't even turn a profit. They carry huge debt. And across all properties, more than a third of their income is off-farm. Of course, this has a heavy impact on mental health. The industry segment that does make money is live export, dominated by huge northern properties, many of which are foreign-owned. So our agriculture system is a social and environmental failure. Our short-term thinking and political responses are breathtakingly inadequate. Times have changed. The climate has changed. The beef industry is costing us $20 billion a year. This industry only operates because these costs are largely hidden from voters, and few politicians will criticise farmers. But an informed public will soon see animal suffering and environmental degradation as an indictment on the beef industry, and graziers will quickly lose their social licence. Click up here for a discussion on how animal agriculture impacts climate, and down here for a series of videos on the Climate Healers discussion paper.